The darkest secret ever revealed among the Amish USA was that she had 5 deformed children with her own father. Amid the verdant plains of Pennsylvania, between well-tended fields and the constant sound of carriage wheels on dirt roads, a disturbing reality lurked, one that had remained hidden for decades. In the summer of 1962, our story begins when a 16-year-old Amish girl named Sarah Stoltzfus suddenly disappeared from the Lancaster County community. That Sarah hadn't run away as initially thought was what no one suspected. Hidden in an isolated cabin deep within the family property, far from the community's curious eyes, she had been placed by her own father, Jacob Stoltzfus. A 42-year-old widower, Jacob had lost his wife during the birth of their 6th child 3 years earlier. The loss had transformed the man. Once respected for his religious devotion and hard work at the local carpentry shop, he was part of an Amish community known for its deliberate isolation from the modern world, for wearing simple clothes, and for rejecting electricity and automobiles. They lived according to centuries-old traditions, prioritizing family, manual labor, and faith. This isolation created a perfect environment where secrets could remain buried for generations. It was only in 1967 that the first suspicions arose when a local midwife, Ruth Miller, was urgently called to the Stoltzfus property. She found Sarah, then 21 years old, in advanced labor upon her arrival. The rest of her life would be disturbed by what the midwife witnessed that night. Alarming characteristics were displayed by the child that came into the world. A disproportionately small head, widely spaced eyes, and fused fingers. Years later, Ruth reported, something was wrong in that family. What Sarah seemed like was a prisoner, not a mother. And Jacob was there, not as a grandfather awaiting her birth, but as a man observing his property. There were 2 other small children in the cabin, the midwife noticed, all with similar physical characteristics, which revealed a disturbing repetition of abnormal traits. The marks of consanguinity were evident in the children. Cognitive problems, facial malformations, motor difficulties, and in some cases, severe heart problems. That this was already the 3rd child born from that forbidden union was what Ruth didn't know. The other 2, kept hidden from the community, presented even more severe conditions. Due to population isolation, marriages between cousins were not uncommon in the Amish community, but a union between father and daughter represented an unforgivable transgression, even within that closed system. The local bishop, Eli Yoder, maintained strict control over marriages to avoid very close unions, but Sarah's situation never came to his knowledge. Deeply hidden among dense trees, the cabin where Sarah lived was almost 2 kilometers from the main Stoltzfus house. Jacob had built the place years before, supposedly as a storage shed. Only 2 rooms were in the simple structure, one for sleeping and another that served as kitchen and living room. The windows were small and covered with dark fabrics, making the interior environment gloomy even during the day. Shortly after their mother's death, Jacob's other children, 2 boys and 2 girls, had been sent to live with relative families in Amish communities in Ohio and Indiana. Potential witnesses and questions about Sarah's whereabouts were eliminated by this strategic separation. When questioned about his daughter's disappearance, Jacob would only say that she had been sent to help her sick aunt in another community. Though vague, the explanation was accepted without many questions, as was customary among the Amish, who valued family privacy above almost everything. Midwife Ruth found herself in a moral dilemma after witnessing the conditions in which Sarah lived. On one hand, breaking the trust placed in her work would mean revealing what she had seen. On the other, consenting to the continued suffering of that young mother and her children would be remaining silent. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. These stories reveal humanity's darkest truths that no one else dares to tell, and you need to know them before time buries them again. The second chapter of this dark story unfolds in 1970 when Sarah Stoltzfus gave birth to her 4th child in even more precarious conditions. By this time, her body already showed visible signs of wear from consecutive pregnancies and a life of confinement. With prematurely grey hair and a permanently empty gaze, at only 24 years old, she looked twice her age. The midwife who had assisted the previous birth, Ruth Miller, had decided to break her silence, but cautiously, without directly confronting the authorities or the Amish bishop, she began to visit the cabin periodically, bringing food, clothes for the children, and basic medications. Gradually, These discreet visits allowed her to document the situation. Born with even more serious problems than his siblings was Sarah's fourth child, a boy Jacob named Elam. His legs were bowed at impossible angles, and a severe facial deformity that made feeding difficult was what he had. His fingers were fused like small claws, and a constant wheeze accompanied his breathing, indicating pulmonary problems. The scientific community was well aware of the effects of consanguinity. The 1970s saw studies that demonstrated how reproduction between close relatives dramatically increases the chance of problematic recessive genes manifesting, resulting in a variety of congenital conditions. 4 cases of parental incest, the pattern of deformities in the Stoltz children followed exactly what was expected. Each new child seemed to present more serious problems than the previous one, Ruth observed in her personal notes found decades later. It was like watching a cruel demonstration of the genetic dangers we were taught in nursing school, but in real time in innocent children. The 3 older children, AIA, 8 years old, Rebecca, 6, and Daniel, 3, showed different degrees of impairment. Isaiah, the firstborn, had severe cognitive difficulties, and at 8 years old he could barely form complete sentences. Rebecca presented an abnormal curvature of the spine and vision problems that left her almost blind. In turn, Daniel suffered from frequent seizures that, without adequate treatment, progressively weakened his nervous system. Jacob kept his children completely isolated from the outside world. They never attended the local Amish school, never participated in Sunday services or community meetings. These children did not officially exist for all intents and purposes. No birth records, vaccination cards, or any documentation proving their existence were there. Ruth discovered that Jacob justified his behavior with a distorted interpretation of the scriptures. In her notes, she mentions that he frequently quoted biblical passages about maintaining the purity of the lineage and obeying the father as one obeys God. This religious manipulation was particularly effective with Sarah, who had grown up learning to never question paternal authority. The cabin where they lived deteriorated over the years. The roof leaked during rains, and cold penetrated through the cracks in the walls during Pennsylvania's rigorous winters. The children all slept together on a single straw mattress on the worn wooden floor while Sarah occupied a small bed in the opposite corner. Jacob rarely spent the night in the cabin. He maintained the appearance of a widower devoted to the community by returning to the main house. The family's diet was precarious, consisting mainly of what Jacob brought during his irregular visits. Bread, potatoes, occasionally milk and eggs. The older children showed clear signs of malnutrition with thin limbs and distended bellies. During the warmer months, Sarah tried to compensate for the scarcity by cultivating a small garden behind the cabin, but her own debilitated health limited what she could produce. The winter of 1971 was particularly severe in Lancaster County. The already remote Stallis cabin was isolated even more by blizzard after blizzard. For almost 3 weeks, Jacob couldn't make the journey to the hideout due to the deep snow. When he finally arrived, he found little Elim dead, his fragile body having not resisted the extreme cold and lack of adequate food. Instead of reporting the death or seeking an appropriate burial, Jacob simply wrapped the child's body in a blanket and buried it at the back of the property under an old oak tree. No ceremony, no headstone, no official acknowledgement that Elim had ever existed was made. Ruth, prevented from visiting during the same period due to weather conditions, was horrified to discover what had happened. This tragic event finally convinced her that she needed to take more drastic measures. She began to systematically document her observations, taking detailed notes on the physical conditions of each child, the living conditions in the cabin, and the behavioral patterns of Jacob and Sarah. At the same time, far away, significant transformations were undergoing American society. The 1970s marked an era of greater awareness about domestic abuse and children's rights. Mandatory reporting laws for health professionals were beginning to be implemented in various states, but Amish communities frequently remained as isolated pockets where authorities rarely interfered. The year 1973 marked a turning point in the Stoltz family's story. Sarah, now 27 years old and pregnant with her 5th child, began to show signs of resistance for the first time. Ruth Miller's notes document subtle changes in the young mother's behavior, hesitant questions about the outside world, requests for books to teach the children to read, and mainly questions about why her children were born different. Today Sarah asked me if all children are born like hers, Ruth wrote in her diary. When I explained that no, that her children had special conditions, I saw something awaken in her eyes, a recognition, perhaps even an understanding of what was really happening. Sarah's growing awareness coincided with changes in the family dynamics. Isaiah, the oldest son, now 11 years old, began to demonstrate aggressive behaviors towards his grandfather, father. Despite his cognitive limitations, the boy seemed to instinctively position himself as the protector of his mother and younger siblings during Jacob's visits. Sarah grew up with limited knowledge about human reproduction and heredity in a community where history and traditions were transmitted orally. Her formal education had ended at 14, as was customary among the Amish, and topics related to intimacy were rarely openly discussed. This knowledge gap facilitated the manipulation exercised by Jacob over the years. Recognizing this vulnerability, Ruth began to educate Sarah discreetly using simple language and analogies with animal breeding, something familiar in the Amish context. The dangers of consanguineous relationships were gradually explained by her. Just as one should not cross horses of the same blood because the foals are born weak, the same happens with people, Ruth carefully explained. When parents and children have children together, the little ones are born with problems. Sarah's fifth pregnancy proved even more complicated than the previous ones. At 7 months, she developed a severe case of preeclampsia with extreme swelling, intense headaches, and blurred vision. Ruth, with her limited experience, recognized the gravity of the situation and insisted to Jacob that Sarah needed hospital care. If she doesn't receive adequate care, both she and the baby could die, the midwife warned. Not even you will be able to hide 2 deaths from the community. Jacob reluctantly allowed Ruth to transport Sarah to a small hospital in York, about 40 kilometers away. To protect his secret, he instructed Sarah to use his late wife's maiden name and to say she was an Amish widow. Ruth, although complicit in this lie, saw in the hospitalization an opportunity to officially document Sarah's condition. The doctors at the hospital were alarmed by the young woman's physical state. In addition to preeclampsia, she showed signs of chronic malnutrition, multiple poorly healed fractures in her arms and legs, and severe anemia. The medical team also noticed scars from previous births, indicating she had given birth several times, contradicting the story that she was a young primiparous widow. Dr. Martin Reynolds, the obstetrician responsible for the case, recorded his suspicions in a confidential report. The patient presents signs consistent with high-risk pregnancy aggravated by a possible situation of prolonged mistreatment. I recommend social evaluation and follow-up after discharge. In a moment alone with Sarah, while Ruth was filling out forms at reception, Dr. Reynolds tried to obtain more information. Sarah, are you safe at home? Is there anyone who causes you fear or who might be harming you or your other children? At this crucial moment, something broke inside Sarah. Years of conditioning and fear had silenced her. But the weeks of conversations with Ruth, and now the genuine concern shown by this strange doctor, made her consider the possibility of a different life. I need you to share this story. If you're watching now, leave a comment saying, "These children deserved protection." We cannot allow stories like this to remain in the shadows. Your voice makes a difference. The birth was induced prematurely due to the risks to Sarah's health. The girl who was born, whom Sarah silently named Hope, weighed only 1.8 kilograms, and like her siblings, showed visible signs of congenital anomalies, a severe cleft palate, disproportionately short limbs, and serious respiratory problems. Dr. Reynolds, now certain he was facing a case of consanguinity, ordered a series of basic genetic tests available at the time. The preliminary results confirmed his suspicions. The pattern of homozygosity was consistent with what would be expected in a case of parental incest. Although detailed genetic analysis was still limited in the early 1970s, the observed markers were sufficient to alarm the medical team. During the 10 days of hospitalization, Sarah began to build a relationship of trust with the hospital's social worker, Martha Clean. While little Hope fought for her life in the neonatal unit, Sarah for the first time felt heard and validated. In fragmented conversations, she began to reveal details of her life in captivity. The autumn of 1973 brought winds of change to the Stoltzfus case. While Sarah and her newborn Hope remained under medical care, a silent investigation began to take shape. Martha Clean, the social worker, had contacted the Lancaster County Sheriff, William Decker, sharing the concerning information she had obtained from Sarah. Decker, a 58-year-old man with decades of experience dealing with local communities, including the Amish, faced a delicate dilemma. On one hand, the accusations were extremely serious. On the other, intervention in Amish matters was rarely well received and could complicate any investigation. "We need to proceed with extreme caution," Decker exclaimed to Martha. "The Amish prefer to resolve their problems internally. If we show up at the property with patrol cars and uniforms, we risk finding nothing. Jacob will be alerted and may hide evidence or even flee with the children." The strategy developed was meticulous. Decker contacted Bishop Eli Yoder not to reveal suspicions about Jacob, but to discuss general issues of child welfare in the community. During the conversation, he casually mentioned the Stoltz name, carefully observing the religious leader's reaction. "Jacob has been a reserved man since he lost his wife," commented the bishop. "He remains faithful to our customs but rarely participates in community meetings. His older children went to live with relatives and his daughter Sarah was sent to Ohio years ago." This confirmation that the bishop believed the story fabricated by Jacob was crucial. It meant that the Amish community was not aware of or involved in covering up the crimes, facilitating the authorities' intervention without alienating the entire religious group. Ruth Miller, the midwife who had documented the case for years, finally handed over her diaries and notes to the authorities. The material included approximate birth dates of the children, detailed descriptions of their physical conditions, and a carefully drawn map showing the location of the hidden cabin on the Stoltzfus property. On October 17, 1973, a discreet team composed of Sheriff Decker, 2 plainclothed deputies, a county doctor, and Martha Clean approached the Stoltz property. To avoid raising suspicions, they used a common vehicle instead of official cars and parked at a considerable distance, completing the rest of the journey on foot. What they found in the cabin confirmed their worst fears. Isaiah, Rebecca, and Daniel lived in deplorable conditions. The smell of urine and mold permeated the environment, and the children wore torn and dirty clothes. There were no toys, books, or any appropriate stimulation for their development. The only furniture besides the beds was an unstable wooden table with 3 uneven benches. Dr. Howard Garrett, the physician accompanying the team, performed preliminary examinations on the children on site. His notes describe, "The 3 minors show clear signs of prolonged medical neglect. The oldest, Isaiah, has a severe untreated dental infection. The girl, Rebecca, has a spinal curvature that, without intervention, will likely leave her completely incapacitated in a few years. The youngest, Daniel, presents open wounds on his legs, possibly due to vitamin deficiency." The operation was timed to occur when Jacob would be in town selling handcrafted furniture at the weekly market. When he returned late in the afternoon, he was intercepted by Decker and his deputies at the entrance to his property. Jacob's reaction when confronted was revealing. Instead of expressing surprise or indignation, he simply lowered his head and said, "So they finally found out." During the initial interrogation at the Lancaster police station, Jacob tried to justify his actions through a distortive mixture of religious principles and personal needs. "After my wife died, I needed someone to take care of me in the house," he stated. Sarah was the oldest. "It was her responsibility. The children happened. I didn't plan it." When questioned about why he kept everything secret, he replied, "I knew you wouldn't understand. Our ways are different from yours. We keep our families together. We take care of our own." This attempt to hide behind cultural practices was quickly rejected by both the authorities and the Amish community itself. Bishop Eli Yoder, upon being informed about the case, unequivocally declared, "This is not our way. Our faith would never allow such an abomination. Jacob disrespected not only your laws, but also ours and especially God's laws." News of the case spread quickly, first among local authorities and then inevitably to the press. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was the first newspaper to publish an article about the case on October 25, 1973 with the carefully formulated headline, family tragedy discovered in rural Pennsylvania community. The article avoided directly mentioning the Amish, but the geographic location made it obvious to local readers. The public reaction was one of horror and indignation. Letters to the editor expressed everything from shock and compassion for the victims to criticism of the authorities for not having discovered the case earlier. Some more extreme voices even questioned the right of Amish communities to maintain their isolation, arguing that it facilitated the cover-up of abuses. For Sarah, who was still recovering in the hospital with her newborn daughter, the events represented an emotional storm. For the first time in 11 years, she was free from her father's control, but faced a completely uncertain future as a 27-year-old Amish woman with no formal education beyond 8th grade. With 4 children with special needs and no skills for the modern world, her prospects seemed bleak. Martha Clean, who had developed a strong bond with Sarah, took on the responsibility of guiding her through this transition period. "What do you want for your future, Sarah?" she gently asked the young mother. "I want my children to stay with me," Sarah replied with surprising determination. "I want them to be able to see the sun every day, learn to read, and never be afraid again." The trial of Jacob Stoltzfus in March 1974 set an important precedent in Pennsylvania's judicial system. It was one of the first cases of parental incest with such extensive evidence to go to trial in the state, and certainly the first involving a member of the Amish community. The cultural sensitivity of the case required special precautions. Judge Henry Crawford, responsible for the case, ordered that the records be partially sealed to protect the identity of the children and that media coverage be restricted. Still, the Lancaster County courtroom was packed every day with people traveling from neighboring counties to witness what many called the trial of the century in the region. Sarah, still extremely fragile physically and emotionally, testified behind a screen to avoid having to face her father. Her almost inaudible voice described years of manipulation and abuse. She related how Jacob had gradually isolated her after her mother's death. First restricting her contact with other young people in the community, then convincing her that it was her responsibility to replace her mother in all aspects. "He said it was God's will," Sarah testified. "That in ancient times this was how families survived, that I was sinning if I disobeyed." The medical testimony was devastating to the defense. Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Garrett presented photographic evidence and detailed reports on the children's conditions. Dr. Benjamin Harris, a geneticist from the University of Pennsylvania, called as an expert, explained in accessible terms how parental consanguinity dramatically increases the risks of congenital defects. In a union between unrelated people, the chance of serious genetic problems is approximately 3 to 4%, Dr. Harris explained. In unions between first cousins, this risk rises to 5 to 7%. But in cases of parental incest like this one, the risk shoots up to 30 to 40%, with a tendency to increase with each consecutive generation. Jacob's defense, realizing the impossibility of denying the facts in the face of the evidence, centered on issues of mental competence and religious influence. His lawyer, Theodore Weiss, argued that the cultural isolation of the Amish and the distorted interpretation of the scriptures had created an alternative reality in which Jacob did not fully understand the immorality and illegality of his actions. This strategy failed when former members of the Amish community testified that far from being encouraged, incest was considered one of the most serious possible transgressions, explicitly mentioned in sermons as an abomination. After only 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all charges, including inappropriate relationship with a minor, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and child neglect. Judge Crawford sentenced Jacob Stoltzfus to 40 years in prison without possibility of parole, effectively ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life incarcerated. In pronouncing the sentence, the judge made a statement that would be cited in law books for decades. This court recognizes and respects the religious and cultural diversity of our nation. However, some lines cannot be crossed in the name of any belief or tradition. The protection of children against abuse transcends all cultural differences and represents a universal value that this court has the sacred duty to uphold. For Sarah and her children, the end of the trial marked the beginning of an equally challenging journey. Little Hope, now 6 months old, remained in fragile health, requiring multiple surgeries to correct her cleft palate and congenital heart problems. Isaiah, Rebecca, and Daniel, after months in temporary homes during the trial, were finally reunited with their mother. Martha Clean, who had become a tireless advocate for the family, helped Sarah establish herself in a small house on the outskirts of York, far enough from Lancaster to avoid stigma, but close enough to maintain some connection with the Amish culture that was still part of her identity. An assistance fund was established through the local Mennonite church, allowing Sarah to receive financial support while learning to navigate the modern world. At 28 years old, she obtained her driver's license, something unthinkable in her previous life, and began classes to complete her high school diploma. The Stoltzfus children faced significant challenges. All four needed extensive therapies: physical, occupational, speech, and psychological. Isaiah, now 12 years old, had the cognitive equivalent of a 5 to 6-year-old child, but demonstrated surprising aptitude for music. Rebecca, partially blind, developed remarkable talent for clay sculptures, using touch to compensate for her limited vision. Daniel, although still suffering from occasional seizures, responded well to the newly developed anticonvulsants of the time. In 1976, 3 years after her liberation, Sarah was invited to share her story at a conference on child abuse at Temple University in Philadelphia. With Martha's help, she prepared a brief speech. Her message was simple but powerful. I was taught that the outside world was dangerous and that only within our community would we find protection. I learned that questioning authority was sin. Now I know that silence can also be sin. My children paid the price for what was not said, for what no one wanted to see. Today I speak for them and for all children who still live in the shadows of silence. The Stoltzfus case eventually led to significant changes in Pennsylvania laws related to mandatory reporting of suspected child abuse. In 1977, the SARS law, as it became known, expanded the list of professionals required to report signs of abuse to include midwives, clergy, and community school teachers, closing loopholes that had allowed the case to remain hidden for so long. For the Amish community, the case represented a moment of self-reflection while maintaining their desire for separation from the modern world. Many communities implemented more rigorous internal checks on child welfare. Bishop Eli Yoder, deeply shaken by not having perceived what was happening literally under his eyes, established regular home visits to all families with children in his congregation. The last Stoltz child, Hope, died in 1980 at 7 years old due to congenital heart complications. Despite the best medical efforts, her multiple conditions eventually overwhelmed her small body. Sarah, devastated but resilient, transformed her grief into purpose. Using part of the money raised for Hope's medical expenses, she established a small foundation in memory of her daughter dedicated to supporting children with disabilities in isolated rural communities. The impact of the Stoltzfus case extended far beyond the small community of Lancaster County. Case studies based on the family were included in medicine, social work, and law curricula at various American universities. The story highlighted not only the biological dangers of consanguinity, but also the social factors that allowed such abuses to remain hidden. Rebecca, who had developed remarkable artistic talent despite her physical limitations, had her sculptures exhibited in a Philadelphia art gallery in 1985. Her works, characterized by complex textures and intricate organic forms, reflected a unique sensitivity shaped by her experience of perceiving the world primarily through touch. An art critic from the Philadelphia Inquirer described her work as palpable in its emotional honesty, revealing a depth of experience that transcends the artist's youth. Isaiah found his voice through music. Although his cognitive limitations remained significant, he demonstrated exceptional musical memory and the ability to reproduce complex melodies after hearing them just once. A local Mennonite church offered him a place in the choir, where his pure, unaffected tenor voice often brought congregants to tears. Daniel, the most reserved of the siblings, found comfort in simple manual work. At 18, he began working part-time in a carpentry shop run by former Amish, who had left the community, but maintained many of their artisanal traditions. The irony that he was following the professional footsteps of his grandfather, Father, did not go unnoticed. But Daniel transformed this dark legacy, specializing in creating wooden toys for children with special needs. Sarah Stoltz completed her GED, equivalent to high school, in 1978 at 32 years old. 2 years later, she enrolled in evening courses at York Community College focusing on child development. Her personal experience combined with this formal knowledge transformed her into a valuable counselor for other abuse survivors. In 1983, 10 years after the discovery of the case, journalist Ellen Burrows from the Washington Post sought out Sarah for a retrospective report. She found a transformed woman, confident, articulate, and deeply committed to child protection. The resulting article, From Darkness to Advocacy, SAR Stoltz's Journey, received a Pulitzer Prize nomination that year. "I will never be completely free of the shadows of the past," Sarah confided to Burrows during the interview. "But I've learned that carrying these shadows doesn't mean being defined by them. Each time I help another family recognize signs of abuse, each time I see my children achieve something that would have seemed impossible years ago, I feel a little more of the weight being lifted." The legacy of the Stoltzfus case also manifested in changes to medical procedures. The University of Pennsylvania Hospital implemented in 1985 a protocol specifically designed to identify potential cases of consanguinity based on the documented observations by the doctors who attended Sarah and her children. The Lancaster Protocol, as it became known, was subsequently adopted by hospitals across the country. Jacob Stoltzfus died in prison in 1991 at 71 years old without ever having demonstrated genuine remorse for his crimes. He refused all contact attempts made by Sarah or his children during his years of incarceration and asked to be buried according to Amish customs. The community, while allowing burial in their cemetery, positioned his grave in the most remote section without headstone or marking. Bishop Eli Yoder, who oversaw the funeral as required by his position, delivered a brief but impactful sermon. "Today we bury not just a man but a reminder of what happens when we stray from the true teachings of God. May his story serve as a warning to future generations, and may the seeds of compassion planted through his family's suffering continue to flourish." Sarah never remarried nor returned to the Amish community. She found her place in what the Amish call the English world, the outside world, but maintained certain values from her upbringing: simplicity, hard work, and faith. Although the latter evolved into a more personal and less dogmatic spirituality. When Isaiah died in 1995 at 33 years old due to heart complications similar to those that took his younger sister, Sarah faced grief again with the same silent strength that characterized her. The funeral, different from the traditional Amish service, included music, Isaiah's own recordings, singing hymns he loved, and emotional testimonies from those whose lives he had touched with his gentleness and musicality. The Stoltz case remains a reference point in studies on cultural isolation and its potential risks. Sociologists and anthropologists frequently cite this story when discussing the delicate balance between respect for cultural autonomy and the need for universal protection of basic human rights, especially of the most vulnerable. In 1998, to mark the 25th anniversary of the discovery of the case, the University of Pennsylvania organized a symposium entitled Beyond the Walls of Silence: Lessons from the Stoltz Case. Sarah, then 52 years old, was the keynote speaker. Her presentation, attended by health professionals, social workers, authorities, and students, received a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. "The story of my family is not just about trauma and suffering," Sarah concluded in her speech. "It's also a story about the human capacity for renewal, about communities that can recognize flaws and work to correct them, about systems that can evolve to better protect the vulnerable, and mainly about the transformative power of truth, however painful it may be." Rebecca and Daniel, the two surviving children, were present that night. Rebecca, now an established artist whose works explored themes of resilience and transformation, and Daniel, who ran a small workshop specializing in adapted toys for children with disabilities. Both embodied their mother's message that even from the darkest circumstances, beauty and purpose can emerge. The Stoltz case, although it occurred more than 50 years ago, continues to reverberate in contemporary discussions about cultural isolation, children's rights, and the role of communities in monitoring the well-being of their most vulnerable members. Pennsylvania's SARS law was subsequently expanded and adapted by several other states, strengthening child protection networks across the country. For those who study the phenomenon of consanguinity, The Stoltz family offers one of the most complete documented cases of the physical, psychological, and social effects of incestuous unions over multiple pregnancies. The medical records, carefully preserved with protected identities for educational purposes, continue to be used in medicine and genetics programs. If you watched until here, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe to learn about other equally impactful stories that reveal humanity's darkest secrets. Leave your like to support our work and share this video with someone who needs to know these hidden realities that silently shape our society. The story of the Stoltzfus reminds us that some of the most important battles for justice and human dignity are fought away from the spotlight in remote communities and seemingly invisible lives. It is a testimony to the power of witness, the courage needed to break cycles of abuse, and the possibility of healing even after unimaginable traumas. As Sarah would say in her last public interview given shortly before her death in 2015, "My hope is that no one else needs to live what we lived. But for those who are still trapped in similar situations, I want them to know there is a path out of the darkness. There are people willing to help, and there is life, a full and meaningful life beyond abuse."